Okay, I think we're going to start. Assuming people will come in when they come in, so we're not eating away at our time. Wanted to say, right, you didn't want to join in on the table, would you? Just so we don't have people sitting alone. Anybody who's sitting alone, you might want to join another table. Hoping that afterwards there will be some opportunity for conversation among people who are in the room. Let me say good morning to everybody. I think you can hear me at the back. Am I right? I need to use the microphone, although I may very well do it for part of it. My name is Linda Choquette. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Literacy. My colleagues are Louise Quinn, who is Executive Director of the Quebec English Literacy Alliance, and Carolyn Vaughn, who's Executive Director of Literacy in Newfoundland and Labrador. Is that?
That's right.
Okay. And the three of us are going to be doing this session this morning based on a project that some of you may be familiar with called Connecting the Dots. It was a project about accountability in the adult literacy field. The Center for Literacy ran collaboratively with Literacy BC and with the Movement for Canadian Literacy a couple of years ago. It ended just about a year ago, and we're hoping at some point to be able to take it forward to the second phase, because I think the findings from the project were energizing enough and galvanizing enough people that we think that there's an opportunity to take it forward. And what we're going to do this morning is describe a little bit about how the project came about, what it was we tried to do, what we think we achieved. Carolyn was one of the people who ended up doing an actual research project during Connecting the Dots. She's going to talk about the kind of tool they developed in Newfoundland and Labrador to facilitate better collaboration between government and providers in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then Louise wasn't part of the project, but took up the tool that was developed in Newfoundland and Labrador, applied it in a completely different context in Quebec to try to create some kind of shared understanding among literacy providers who didn't necessarily always have a common vision or understanding of how they were doing that in their own products. And that is where we're going to end this morning and then open it up and have some conversation with you as well. So the project itself actually grew out of the Summer Institute at the Center for Literacy that happened almost 5 years ago. It was a summer institute that had followed one that we had done on policy and practice, where we had a very vibrant group. I don't know if anybody in this room was at the Policy Institute 6 years ago, but Joe Lodietto from Australia and ended up talking to people about the need for practitioners to be policy literate. He argued that we couldn't possibly have influence on policymakers or engage in meaningful exchange with them unless we understood how policy was created. And out of that, at the end of the event, people said, we need to have a conversation about some of the accountability frameworks that are currently in place in this country and what impacts they have on providers, on programs, etc. What there actually is in the country. And we decided we would do the next institute on that. But the following year was the year when funds were very dry, when funding didn't come through, when people registered and said, we don't have funds to pay the registration fee, could we pay part of it, who will pay it when our funding comes through? And as it happened, most people, their funding didn't come through and they began to withdraw as the institute neared. We ended up at the end with only 25 people, which was, but we went ahead with it anyway. The other thing that happened was we found that funders were not registering. We were trying to set up an environment where funders and providers could meet together and talk together. And a number of funders actually said that they were afraid to come. They felt that it was being set up to hack them or and said, this is a very bizarre perception out there. And then a number of them also said, this was the flip side of it. The providers who came, and for anyone who's ever participated in our institutes, they're very participatory events, and we built them around people who register. So if you register, we'll say this is the topic this year, these are the questions, have you done anything in your own program or your own environment that you'd like to share, and we build it into the program. That year, all the providers who came wrote a note saying, I am not ready to present anything. I was coming to listen. Well, there were only 25 of us, and 24 people who registered said they were only coming to listen, which didn't leave us with very many people who were actually prepared to share anything. What we perceived was that there was tremendous fear. An awful lot of people said, well, I'm afraid to speak out publicly about this. I'm afraid if I speak out, my funding will be cut. And a group of us at the Institute spent the better part of 3 days saying, what's wrong with this picture? Why is this happening? Why are funders afraid to come to the table? And why are providers afraid to talk about an issue that should be openly addressed? And out of that, we received some projects that maybe we need to investigate a little more carefully what is it that's actually happening. And we made a submission to this, which was funded, called Connecting the Dots. And the goals of the project were to consolidate and exchange knowledge about what current accountability policy and practice in adult literacy look like in Canada and abroad, which we did. We were trying to find a common language that could be used between policymakers and providers so that they could actually talk about the issues. And that didn't exist. I'm not sure how far we moved along that, but we definitely did develop a couple of action research projects where people in particular places managed to create some dialogue with funders and create some tools to help them do it. Carolyn is going to talk about one that was probably the one that was most developed in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we wanted to try to build on that knowledge and develop some what we call them innovative models that could be replicated. So we put out a call for action research sites and to be funded by people across the country. There was one in Alberta that explored what they call mutual accountability, and the question they asked was, what characteristics of the relationship between Calgary Learns, which was a funder, not a government funder, and two Bow Valley adult literacy basic education programs providers support mutual accountability and how these characteristics strengthened or nurtured. Okay? And they developed a tool which has been shared at symposia but not published because all we did was end up developing a draft of the tool. We didn't get to the point where we could refine it, but we're hoping we can still do that. Another group in British Columbia, the Storytellers Foundation, created something called Literacy Outcomes Community Interventions, and they were looking at a tool that could measure learner progress in improving social capital for learners who participated in the programs. And they too developed a draft of a program. All of the documentation for the project is on our website. There's a whole site for Connecting the Dots. It's got the literature review, and it's got all of the action research projects and descriptions, and not all the tools, except for Caroline's, because they haven't been completed. There was one in Peterborough. The Native Literacy Center developed something called an accountability framework for the Native Literacy stream, and they did something quite exciting. They actually found that most of the Native literacy programs in Ontario were found not to be conforming with the outcomes they needed to achieve their basic skills program. And the program sat down with the community and developed a framework where they looked at all the outcomes that were required by the government for the programs and then translated them on the other side into actual practices that were undertaken in the Native program to show them how they could demonstrate that some of what they were doing was in fact meeting those outcomes, but they were using very different language. And we thought that was an extremely exciting tool because we saw the possibility of that being applied in other contexts. In Quinte, in Ontario, in the adult day school, they did something called measuring these were lawn, self-management, and self-direction outcomes from adult literacy programs, and they were using a framework that was developed by the United Way and applying it to a literacy program, and they too were trying to refine that. And then finally, Carolyn's program in Newfoundland and Labrador developed something that they call, what did you actually call it again?
The tool itself?
Yeah.
Well,
you did. Sorry, it was called a practicing shared accountability. That's correct. And they ended up with the tool that we're going to play with today. And they were looking for a way to establish an ongoing dialogue with their funders and the government that could allow them to sit at the same table without being in an adversarial relationship where they could actually relate to one another. Out of that project, what we ended up with this linkage report where we had key findings, and I'm just going to share those with you very quickly. But again, I've brought, maybe not for everybody, but they're all up on the website. Among the findings, we found that obviously people had multiple accountabilities, so that we needed to recognize that every stakeholder has multiple accountabilities, and that until we understood what those accountabilities were, we couldn't engage in real dialogue with one another. So if we didn't understand the accountabilities that our funders had to various forces and frameworks they were working inside, and they didn't understand the accountabilities that providers felt. Providers don't just feel accountable to funders, they feel accountable to their learners, they feel accountable to their communities, they feel accountable sometimes to sets of principles and practices. So there are multiple accountabilities, and without understanding what those are, you can't find the space that you can negotiate. So you couldn't possibly just impose framework. We wanted to look for the spaces where there were some things we said, we can't really do that in our program, but we could do this instead, and find out if you couldn't build in some other requirements besides what were in there. The second one was that you needed to have opportunity to reflect on the conditions that you were working under, that you had to earn and maintain trust, that it was almost impossible to be accountable if there wasn't a relationship of trust. And in a lot of places, there were people felt that there was constant turnover, right? That they didn't even have a chance to develop a relationship with the person who was overseeing their program. How could you possibly engage in dialogue with the person under those circumstances? So there had to be opportunities to get to know one another and to develop some trust. You had to have some open communication and shared knowledge. I mean, again, one of the findings, we did a field review where we interviewed 134 people, and a large number of those were providers in every province and territory in the country. We had 7 field reviewers, and 30 or more of them were funders. And from that, we found that there was a whole lot more common ground than we had anticipated. We thought the findings were going to be a lot more adversarial. We actually found that there was quite a lot of agreement both among funders, and that a lot of funders talked about feeling caught in the middle because they actually recognized that the conditions on the ground didn't match some of the requirements they had to impose, but they also didn't know where they needed to turn so that they could talk about it and make a case for the people on the ground. So that became an issue. So you had to have the open communication, you had to have shared knowledge. We found that when there was turnover, both in programs and among funders, that quite often there was no mechanism for passing on knowledge, so that suddenly there was a rupture and had a new person come in, and they didn't know the program, but there hadn't been any opportunity for the person leaving to brief them or pass anything on so that the next person could pick it up to make an introduction, to be able to talk to people. The fifth lesson was that the human and financial resources had to be adequate to the task of delivering on the outcomes of being held accountable, that accountability requirements were increasing without necessarily funding the mechanisms, the funding that you needed, the staffing you needed to fulfill the requirements. People also talked about sometimes being held accountable for contradictory outcomes. So in some places people had multiple funders, and the funders had different accountability frameworks, and they were spending a lot of their time reporting to different funders, but occasionally the requirements actually were in conflict. So they had to report on certain outcomes for one set of funders and a different set of outcomes for another set of funders, and they were confident. So that was another issue. That there had to be attention to both financial and performance accountability, and that somehow an awful lot of the understanding around accountability had been focused on the financial, on reporting how the dollars were spent, and far less on reporting on what was actually being achieved as outcomes. And then there had to be policy consistency and policy coherence. And people talked about rapid changes in policy, how they just got used to working with a framework, with the policy, and suddenly it was being changed. People talk about constant churn of people, but churn of policy as well. So you just got to understand what policy or the framework was, and suddenly it was being revised, it was being reformed. And then finally, that the ways that providers were held accountable could compromise their actual ability to be accountable. So sometimes we were so caught up in the process of being held accountable that in fact